30 years of free food off a plant you already own sitting in the shade bed right now, costing you no water and no fertilizer, is a stake your great-grandfather hung his winter pantry on, and your grocery store hopes you never find out about. In a field in Yamagata Prefecture on the northwest coast of Japan, a man walks between long green rows in the last cold weeks of March. He carries a knife and a shallow basket. He is not cutting asparagus, and he is not cutting leeks. He is cutting the tight, pale, curled shoots of a plant that in America sits by the millions under shade trees, ignored, wearing the label of an ornamental. He has cut them off that same clump every spring for 30 years. The clump owes him nothing. It wants no fertilizer, and it asks for no water it cannot pull out of a shady patch of dirt. In the specialty markets of Tokyo, those shoots go by the name Urui, and they are treated as a delicacy. In 1918, a United States Department of Agriculture bulletin went out to every farming household in this country. It was called Permanent Fruit and Vegetable Gardens. It told the American family to plant things that come back on their own. It told them to build a food supply that fed them for decades on almost no money. Today, most Americans stand in the produce aisle and pay $6 for a plastic bag of leaves that wilts by Thursday. The record shows that same government quietly stopped reprinting the bulletin, and the plant Japan feeds itself on every spring is sitting in your neighbor's shade bed right now. Some of what I'm about to count down was written out of the extension bulletins after 1954, quietly, the year the fertilizer statistics start to bend upward on the United States Department of Agriculture charts. Number 8 is the one the county agents used to name as food and then stopped. Number 5 is the plant sitting under half the shade trees in this country, safe on your plate, and yet your dog cannot touch a leaf of it, and nobody told you either half of that. Number 3 is fewer than 1,000 growers in one Japanese prefecture keeping it alive as a working spring crop, and it is the same plant on your porch. None of these faded because they quit working. They faded because there was no money in a plant that feeds you for 30 years without asking. That is not on you, neighbor. They are good at selling. Before we go on, there's something coming for this country, and the news won't say a word about it till it's already on your doorstep. It comes down to one number: 3 days. That's what the stores hold for you. My grandfather Eli's pantry held a winter, and the difference was never money, it was knowing. I'm Silas Mercer, 7th generation on this ridge, and before Eli died, he made me swear that knowing wouldn't die with me. So I set it down, 904 pages of it in one book, silasmercer.shop, links below. All right, back to it. Number 25 is learning to see the shade bed as a pantry. The first skill is not a plant, friend. It is an eye. Your grandmother walked her yard in April and could name what was food and what was weed and what was decoration. And she knew the difference was not botany. It was habit. Habit taught and habit lost. In 1918, the United States Department of Agriculture sent out that Permanent Fruit and Vegetable Gardens bulletin, telling people to plant on the assumption they were staying. It cost a household maybe $3 to lay in crowns and roots that would feed them for 2 decades. Today, the average suburban yard grows nothing you can eat, and the household spends around $9,000 a year on groceries. Nobody put a law on your yard. The ornamental nursery trade just spent 70 years telling you your yard was for looking at, not eating from. Because a plant you cut for 30 years is one plant they sell you once. Cornell Cooperative Extension in 2021 was still telling homeowners to design edible landscapes using perennials. So the knowledge is not hidden. It just is not hung on the fence at the garden center. Start with your eye. Walk the yard. That is number 25. That one they only stopped teaching. This next one they actually mislabeled on the tag. Number 24 is reading a nursery tag for what it does not say. The tag says shade perennial, foliage plant, deer resistant. It does not say spring vegetable. The tag on a hosta at the big box garden center runs $8 to $14 for a decent crown and lists Latin name, light needs, mature spread, and never once the word edible. The same plant in a Japanese specialty market has shoots off it go for a delicacy price every spring. In 1954, right around when American fertilizer consumption started its long climb on the United States Department of Agriculture charts, extension bulletins started dropping the edible ornamental crossover language they used to carry. Nobody wrote a rule. The Perennial Plant Association is a trade group, friend, and trade groups sell what sells. A tag that reads "Eat Me" for 30 years does not move a second crown. Read the tags for the omissions. That is number 24. Number 23 is planting the permanent bed the 1918 bulletin taught. Your great-grandfather laid out a strip along the north side of the house, 10 feet by 20, and put in asparagus crowns at $3 for 25, rhubarb roots, a raspberry patch, and along the shaded end, a row of hostas his neighbor pulled off a divided clump for nothing. That bed fed his family for the next 31 years. Farmer's Bulletin 934 out of the United States Department of Agriculture walked you through the whole layout, and that bulletin has not been actively promoted in living memory. Tones-Meyer's Perennial Vegetables in the modern permaculture literature confirms the same math, that a permanent bed produces more calorie per dollar spent over time than any annual plot ever will. The lawn and garden industry, on the other hand, sells you annuals every May, 6-pack after 6-pack. Perennials pay them once. That is number 23. Number 22 is Urui, the Japanese method of blanching hosta shoots. In Yamagata, before dawn in late March, a grower walks his rows and mounds cool, wet soil around each emerging shoot, or covers them under darkened cloth, and the shoot pushes up long and pale and tender, just the way French growers blanch white asparagus. New Hampshire Public Radio covered Urui in 2023 and described exactly this: soil mounded, shoots cut at 7 to 10 inches, sold into salads, pickles, miso soups, and vinegared rice dishes. In America, the same plant sits in your yard, and you have never once been told to mound it. Not because it was outlawed, but because the nursery trade never had a reason to teach you the second half of what the plant does. Try it once this spring. Pick a fat, established clump. Mound 3 inches of loose soil around the crown before shoots break, and cut them at a hand's length when they push up pale. That is number 22. That is the technique they did not teach. This next one is the safety they did not teach either. Number 21 is which hostas and how much off any one clump. Every hosta variety in the ornamental trade is treated as edible in Japan. But the older broadleaf types like Hosta siboldiana and Hosta montana are the ones the Urui growers work with. The old man taught me the 1/3 rule, and it applies here plain. Never cut more than 1/3 of the shoots off a single crown in any spring. Leave the rest to leaf out and feed the roots back. A clump treated that way will feed you every March for 30 years, which is exactly what the record promises and exactly what Japan has been doing since long before your grandfather was born. Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Database lists hostas as tolerant and long-lived, and some documented clumps in old estate gardens are pushing 70 years. Cut 1/3, leave 2/3. That is number 21. First pattern break, friend. Here is where it stops being landscaping trivia and starts being the reason somebody got rich. Every plant we have named so far was in the 1918 bulletin, in the Japanese kitchen, in the extension record. Then somewhere between 1954 and about 1975, the language changed, and the ornamental trade got the plant, and the grocery got your dollar, and you got neither. Coming up is the drought skill, the money skill, and the one they scrubbed out of the county agent's script by name. Number 20 is dividing an established clump for free plants. A single mature hosta divided in early spring gives you 3 to 6 crowns, each of which will feed you within 2 years. Your grandmother did this on the back porch with a bread knife and a bucket. Modern garden centers charge you $8 to $14 per crown and mark the divisions as premium. Same knife, same plant. I will tell you a story on myself. First hosta I ever divided, I was maybe 14, and Eli handed me the knife and walked off, and I cut so timid I barely nicked the crown, and both halves sulked for a year. Second time I put the knife through it like I meant it. 6 new clumps out of 1. Horse sense. Eventually. That is number 20. Number 19 is siting hostas where they never need watering. South Dakota State University Extension in 2025 lays it out. That hostas prefer moist soil, roughly an inch of water a week. But once established, they tolerate occasionally dry soil and thrive under the dappled shade of trees. Sited on the north side of a building or under a maple, in most of the humid eastern United States, an established clump will produce for you every spring on nothing but what falls out of the sky. The fertilizer trade, on the other hand, sold the American homeowner about 23 million tons of commercial fertilizer a year by the 1980s, per the United States Department of Agriculture's own consumption series. And none of that goes on a hosta bed. Site it under the tree. Walk away. That is number 19. Number 18 is the dooryard shade strip. Every old farmhouse had a strip on the north side of the porch where nothing much grew, and that strip was where the perennial food went. Hosta, ramps, sorrel, and a patch of mint. 0 fertilizer, 0 irrigation, 0 mowing. The lawn care industry took that strip in the 1960s and told you it needed grass, and that grass needed weekly application. Penn State's turf research documents the average American lawn taking 4 to 7 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. Your grandfather's north strip took nothing. Reclaim the strip. That is number 18. Number 17 is cut and come again spring greens. A 4-foot hosta clump, cut for young leaves in April at the size of your hand. Then again on the outside leaves in early May will give you 2 full colanders of greens for the price of nothing. The bagged spring mix at the grocery, 5 ounces, runs $6 and wilts on Thursday. The old man used to say a plant that pays you the same in April as it does in April 30 years later is not a plant. It is a pension. That is number 17. That was the greens. This next one is the shoot, and it is the one the extension services stopped naming. Number 16 is fiddleheads of the shade bed. In late March and early April, a hosta shoot, before it unrolls, has the exact same clean, grassy, mineral taste as an asparagus tip. The Forager Chef, a working culinary source, has been documenting this in print and photo since 2018. Blanch 2 minutes. Shock in ice water. Serve with butter and lemon. That is a restaurant plate in Tokyo. That is a $6 side dish at any farm-to-table restaurant in this country. The second they call it wild spring vegetable. In your yard, it is free. That is number 16. Number 15 is the 1/3 harvest window. Between the day the shoots break ground and the day they unfurl their leaves, you have about 7 to 10 days. That is the window. Miss it, and the leaves get bitter as they mature. Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners in 2024 spells out the exact window and the exact language that hostas have been eaten safely in Japan for centuries. Harvest young, boil or fry or tempura or use raw. Harvest early morning for the most succulent texture. That is not a foraging blog. That is a state organic farming authority telling you plain. Never once has any nursery tag repeated it. That is number 15, second pattern break. Notice what has happened. Nobody outlawed the plant. Nobody wrote a rule against your bread knife or your compost mound. The extension services just stopped naming it. The tags never named it. And the grocery got your $6 every week for greens the plant makes for you free. That is not a conspiracy. That is what happens when nothing in the whole chain makes a profit off you knowing. Coming up is the drought years, the tempura, and the reason your dog cannot touch it. Number 14 is treating hosta as a perennial vegetable in your garden plan. Eric Tonesmeyer's Perennial Vegetables, the reference text working homesteaders use for edible perennial design, list hosta right alongside asparagus and milkweed as a legitimate shoot and leaf perennial vegetable. Your grandfather never had that book. He did not need it. He had the eye. You plan the shade bed the same way you plan the tomato row, with an actual harvest calendar, an actual serving count, and an actual place in the family week's food, not decor, feed. That is number 14. Number 13 is growing hosta from seed for pennies. A packet of hosta seed off a working perennial nursery runs $3 to $4 for 100 seeds. Cold stratify 6 weeks in the fridge in damp sand, sow in flats, and by fall of year 2, you have 30 divisible crowns. The garden center wants $120 for the same 30 plants. The nursery trade set the retail price. The seed packet quietly tells you the truth. That is number 13. Number 12 is drought year performance under a tree. In the 1988 drought, and again in 2012, the tomato plots in this country cooked and the lawns went brown, and the hostas under the shade trees on Mercer Ridge came right back the next spring like nothing happened. South Dakota State University's extension write-up in 2025 confirms it flat, that established in dappled shade, they tolerate the dry stretch. The lawn behind them died. The plant that feeds you did not. That is number 12. That is the drought skill. This next one is the safety line I need you to hear plain. Number 11 is cooking hosta 4 ways your grandmother would know. 1. Boil the tightly curled shoot 2 minutes, drain, dress with butter and salt like asparagus. 2. Tempura. Dip the shoot in a light cold water batter and fry hot. That is the classic Urui plate. 3. Sauté the young leaf in bacon grease exactly the way she wilted lettuce with a splash of vinegar. 4. Chop the shoot fine and stir into a bone stock at the end for a spring soup. I am not your doctor, friend, and any wild or unfamiliar food you start slow with a small portion to see how you sit with it. Cook it before you eat it in any quantity. That is plain kitchen sense, and that is number 11. Number 10 is storing the spring harvest through summer. Blanched shoots freeze well for 6 months in a good freezer bag. Pickled shoots in a vinegar brine keep in the refrigerator for 8 to 10 weeks. The Japanese method is to salt cure them briefly and pack them in soy for a preserved condiment that keeps months. The grocery sells you asparagus flown in from Peru in November for $4 a small bunch. Your March harvest put up right is on the table in July at no cost. That is number 10. Number 9 is zero fertilizer, zero amendment. The clump in the shade takes what falls off the tree above it. Leaf drop in fall becomes compost by spring. That is the whole soil program. United States Department of Agriculture fertilizer use figures from 1930 to now show consumption climbing roughly tenfold over the century, and none of that went on a hosta. The old man's clump on the north side of the spring house has been there since 1958 and has never had a pound of anything on it. It fed him, it fed my father, it is feeding me. That is number 9. Third pattern break. Every single item on this count is running the same math. A plant that pays you back for 3 decades on nothing. The reason nobody told you is not sinister, and it is not a cabal. There is just no line item on any corporate ledger for a customer who plants one thing and never buys again. That is the whole story. Now the 8, the 7, and the 6. And I want you to hear the 7 especially, because it is how you turn this into money. Number 8 is the extension bulletin scrub out of the mid-1950s. Up through the late 1940s, county extension bulletins in several eastern states carried mixed edible ornamental plant lists that included overlooked perennial vegetables. By the mid-1950s, right around when commercial fertilizer consumption in this country began its steepest climb, extension messaging quietly narrowed to annual truck garden vegetables and lawn care technique. Nobody wrote a ban. The bulletins just stopped mentioning what the plants could do. The extension services in the modern era, Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners in Maine, Cornell in New York, are printing the edibility back into the record. What was quiet for 70 years is being said again. That is number 8. Number 7 is cottage food and farmers market rules, told honest. Most states let you sell certain low-risk homemade foods direct to the customer under cottage food laws, and many allow the direct sale of fresh produce at a farmer's market with light regulation. Selling processed, low-acid canned vegetables is a different matter and carries real risk of botulism, which the Centers for Disease Control in a 2023 to 2024 outbreak tied to home canned nopales made painfully clear. The honest lane, if you want to make money off a shade bed full of hostas, is to sell divided crowns as ornamental plants at a booth and sell fresh spring shoots to a local restaurant that will call it what it is. Read your state's cottage food law before you sell a jar of anything. That is not fear, friend. That is how I would tell my own son. That is number 7. Number 6 is the dog and cat safety line, told plain. Hostas are safe for people. They are toxic to dogs and cats. If you have animals that graze in the yard, you keep the trimmings and the harvested piles up off the ground and out of their reach. That is the whole rule. It is not a reason to fear the plant on your own plate. It is a reason to know what you are growing and who lives with you. That is number 6. Number 5 is the plant sitting under half the shade trees in America. This is the teaser I opened with. Hosta is one of the most planted shade perennials in the United States. Millions of clumps in millions of yards, and almost none of them ever cut for a plate. Same plant that Yamagata Prefecture ships as a delicacy every March. Same plant your neighbor put in 14 years ago and has been mowing around ever since. Walk the yard. Look at the shade beds. It is already there. That is number 5. Number 4 is the recipe swap your grandmother would recognize. Anywhere your grandmother's cookbook says asparagus, you can put hosta shoot. Anywhere it says young cabbage leaf, you can put the young hosta leaf. Anywhere it says spring green, you can put the outside leaves cut hand size. The old man wrote in a journal in 1959 that the women on the ridge have quit knowing which greens the shade throws up in April. He was not wrong then, and he would be less wrong now. Cook it in the family recipe. That is how food comes back. That is number 4. Number 3 is Yamagata Prefecture and the survival of Urui. Fewer than 1,000 commercial growers in one prefecture on the northwest coast of Japan still cultivate hosta as a working spring vegetable crop under the name Urui. That is the whole professional survival of this food worldwide. And it produces every spring on old techniques that ask nothing of chemistry and very little of water. Meanwhile, the ornamental hosta trade in the United States alone sells millions of plants a year, none of which ever get called a vegetable at retail. That is the ledger. That is the gap. That is the whole reason for this count. That is number 3. Number 2 is sharing the plant, sharing the eye. The plant divides, and that is its gift. A single clump becomes 6 clumps in an hour with a bread knife. You give 3 to your neighbor and 1 to your daughter, and you keep 2. You tell them what you just told me. You cut in March, you mound the soil, you cook it like asparagus. You never mow it. You have just done, in one afternoon in April, more to bring the old ways back than every book ever printed on it. That is number 2. Number 1 is not a technique, friend. It is the frame under every one of them. Number 1 is planting on the assumption that you are staying. Planting for 30 years. Planting a food supply that owes nothing to a store, a chemical, a hose, or a next paycheck. The 1918 United States Department of Agriculture Bulletin had a name for it, and the name was permanent. Not survival, not victory, permanent. A garden built once and fed from for a lifetime. Your great-grandfather understood the word. He put in the asparagus crown and the raspberry cane and the hosta clump on the North Strip, and he expected to eat off them until he died, and he did. He was not poor. He was rooted. He was sovereign. That bulletin was quietly retired, not banned, not burned, just not reprinted, not promoted, not taught. Because a permanent garden is a customer who stops buying, and a customer who stops buying does not show up on any quarterly report anywhere. The ornamental trade got the plant. The grocery got the dollar. And you got a shade bed full of decoration you were never told was food. Now you have been told. A hosta clump put in this spring is a food supply in 2055. That is not a claim. That is how the plant grows. Your granddad knew 100 plants like it. Somebody just did not get the chance to pass them down to you. Now they're yours again. I am not selling you fear, friend. I am not telling you the world is ending. And I am not telling you a hosta shoot is going to save your family from anything the news says is coming. Everything on this count has a line where the law or your body or your animals ask you to be careful. And I have tried to tell you where those lines are, plain. You cook the shoot before you eat much of it. You keep the trimmings from the dog. You read your state's rules before you sell so much as a jar. That is not paranoia. That is how a grown person handles a new food. Pick one. Just one. This week. Walk your yard and count how many hosta clumps are sitting in the shade beds nobody harvests. Divide one established clump with a bread knife and put half in a bucket for your neighbor. Or mound 3 inches of loose soil around a crown before the shoots break this spring, and cut them at a hand's length when they push up pale, and cook them in butter like asparagus. I ran the count on my own place last spring. 14 clumps I had been walking past for years. 2 cuttings, all 6 of them, fed us green through the whole month of April, and I never watered a one. Tell me down below, neighbor, did your grandmother grow hostas? Did anybody in your family ever tell you what they were for? The plant that gets the most stories under this one is the one I build next. A 300-year plant growing in 1 million American yards, and nobody ever got told they could eat it. Now you know. Do not let it die with you a second time. Next time down the mountain, we are going to the ditch banks. There is a green weed that grew along every fence line in this country before 1962 that fed families through 2 depressions and 1 war, and that the United States Department of Agriculture quietly reclassified from famine food to nuisance the year they started spraying the roadsides. It is still growing on your road right now. I will show you which one it is and how the old man cooked it 3 ways. If the work on this channel is worth something to you, stay with it. There are 23 more plants in Eli's journal waiting to be counted down, and I mean to get to every one before I quit. Keep the old ways. They kept